The words sliced through the air like a blade. They didn't come gently or with hesitation. They were spat out with authority, with a coldness that made Tanya Williams' blood freeze. Her 12-year-old son, Jordan, was slumped against her side, clutching his chest, his breathing shallow and uneven. She could feel the rise and fall of his little body trembling against her arm, could hear the wheeze that scraped from his throat. She could see the terror in his wide brown eyes. But the nurse, the one in front of her, the one standing behind the glass desk with a clipboard in her hand, refused to move, refused to care. The emergency room was packed. Every chair was taken, people leaning against walls, some standing, with arms folded, others pacing the floor as though they had been waiting too long. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint taint of blood and sweat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The beeping of machines, the occasional shout of a doctor down a hallway, and the distant wail of an ambulance siren outside created a backdrop that should have screamed urgency. But here, in this corner where Tanya stood, urgency was being deliberately ignored. Tanya's voice cracked, louder than she intended, drawing the eyes of those seated nearby. My son can't breathe. He needs help now. Her hands shook as she tried to steady Jordan, tried to keep him upright. His small fingers gripped hers tightly, desperately, as if he knew his life depended on her strength in that moment. The nurse barely looked up. Her expression was flat, dismissive, her lips curled in a faint sneer. Fill out the forms, sit down, wait your turn. A wave of heat rushed through Tanya's body, not from the stuffy air, but from rage. Wait our turn. Look at him. He's turning pale. He's gasping for air. Tanya's words cracked with disbelief. The nurse gave a long, exaggerated sigh, glanced at the screen in front of her, and muttered, "Others are ahead of you. You'll have to wait." Behind Tanya, a murmur rippled through the waiting room. Some people looked away quickly, as though pretending not to hear. A man with a baseball cap leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made her frown deeply. A young woman, no older than 20, bit her lip and shook her head, eyes fixed on Jordan's trembling body. Tanya felt all of it, the whispers, the stares, the silence of those who knew this was wrong but didn't dare speak. She wanted to scream at every single one of them, to force them to rise to their feet, to demand justice with her. But all she could do was hold her son tighter, her heart hammering in her chest, fear pounding louder than the beeping machines down the hall. "Mum." Jordan's voice was so faint, barely more than a whisper. "It hurts. I can't." His little hand pressed harder against his chest, his breaths coming quicker, each one shallower than the last. That should have been enough to send any nurse, any doctor, rushing to his side. That should have been the moment when humanity rose above procedure. But the woman at the desk only shook her head again, as though Tanya's son was nothing but an inconvenience, as though his suffering didn't matter, as though his life wasn't worth the urgency given to others. "Please," Tanya begged now, her voice breaking. She didn't care about pride or appearances. She was on her knees emotionally, her power stripped in this moment, reduced to nothing more than a desperate mother pleading for her child's life. "He can't wait. Please, I'm begging you." The nurse's answer was ice. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, I'll have security escort you out." The room went still. It was as if every sound muted, as if the weight of that threat hung over Tanya like a storm cloud. The humiliation burned through her chest, hotter than fire. She felt as though every eye was piercing her, every whisper cutting her deeper. Her son could barely breathe, and she was being threatened with removal for being loud, for daring to demand that her black child be treated like any other patient. And then the nurse turned to call another name. A man across the room, who had walked in only minutes before, stood and walked past Tanya and her son. He looked at her briefly, guilt flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing. He followed the nurse, leaving Tanya and Jordan exactly where they had been abandoned, dismissed and invisible. Have you ever seen someone being denied basic humanity? Have you ever stood frozen, watching something so obviously cruel unfold, and wondered why no one else was standing up, why no one else was speaking? Imagine being in Tanya's shoes right now. Imagine hearing your child gasp for air while people look away, while staff pretend you don't exist, while rules are used as weapons against you instead of lifelines. That was the moment Tanya Williams, one of the most powerful CEOs in the city, realized that her success, her wealth, her influence meant nothing here. To them, she was just a black mother with a sick child, and in their eyes, that was enough reason to push her to the back of the line. Her blood boiled, her heart ached, and deep inside, something shifted, because Tanya knew this night would not end here. Something was going to change. Something had to. What would you have done if you were standing there, watching this unfold? Would you have spoken up, or would you have sat in silence, pretending it wasn't happening? Let me know in the comments, because silence in moments like this is as dangerous as the injustice itself. The waiting room felt heavier than air itself. After the nurse's sharp dismissal, after the cruel words that told Tanya and her son to wait, a thick silence rippled across the emergency room like an invisible wave. People had heard, they had seen, and now they stared. Tanya could feel it, the weight of every pair of eyes pressing down on her back. Some were quick, nervous glances that darted away the moment she looked up, like thieves caught in the act of stealing something unseen. Others lingered longer, bold in their quiet judgment, studying her as though she were the problem, as though she was making too much noise, too much fuss, too much of herself in a place where she was expected to sit down and obey. She tried not to meet their gazes, but it was impossible. When your child is gasping for breath, every detail sharpens the way a man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the way a woman clutched her handbag tighter against her lap, the way two teenagers in the corner stopped scrolling their phones and whispered to each other, their eyes flicking nervously between Jordan's trembling body and the nurse's cold indifference. One older woman, maybe in her late 50s, didn't look away. Her wrinkled hands clutched a cane, and her mouth tightened with disapproval, but not at Tanya. Her gaze was fixed on the desk, on the nurse who had brushed them off so easily. She muttered something, shaking her head. Tanya couldn't hear the exact words, but the motion of her lips was clear enough. If that was my child, they'd be rushing him inside. The truth of it stung. Jordan wheezed beside her, his small chest rising and falling too quickly. His forehead glistened with sweat, his skin taking on a pale, almost grey shade. Tanya wiped his face with trembling fingers, whispering, "Hold on, baby. Just breathe, stay with me." Her own chest hurt from how fast her heart was beating, from how powerless she felt. A man across the aisle, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his brow, shifted uneasily. His wife leaned close to him, whispering, but her eyes never left Tanya. Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. The man gave a small shake of his head, like he was telling her to stay quiet, to stay out of it. He never looked Tanya in the eyes, On the far side of the room, a young woman, maybe a college student, sat with her laptop on her knees. Her eyes darted from her screen to Tanya, then to the boy gasping for air. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. She looked like she wanted to stand, like she wanted to say something, but fear held her down. She bit her lip, the conflict written all over her face. The silence was unbearable. Tanya could feel the judgment from some, the pity from others. And worse, their inaction. People were watching a child struggle to breathe, and no one was moving. Some lowered their eyes quickly, pretending they hadn't seen, pretending they weren't part of it, pretending it wasn't their problem. And yet, Tanya knew. Every single person in that room was part of it. Every silent witness gave strength to the nurse's indifference. Every averted gaze confirmed the cruelty of the system that saw Jordan's life as worth less. Her son whimpered softly, and Tanya's heart shattered all over again. She kissed his damp forehead, whispering, "Mummy's here. I won't let anything happen to you." But even as she said it, she felt the eyes again burning, heavy, unspoken words hovering in the air like smoke. Why weren't they helping? Why weren't they speaking? Was it fear? Was it apathy? Or was it that quiet, poisonous thought, "It's not my problem," that allows injustice to thrive in plain sight? Every person in that room had a choice: to stay silent or to stand up, to look away or to stare down the wrong being committed before their very eyes. And most, Tanya realized with a sinking feeling, were choosing silence. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't just fighting for her son's life. She was fighting against a room full of silence, against the weight of complicity, against the kind of bystander apathy that history had repeated far too many times before. And in that silence, Tanya's fury began to grow. What about you, watching this right now? If you had been sitting in that waiting room, if you had seen a child clutching his chest while a nurse waved him away like an inconvenience, what would you have done? Would you have spoken? Or would you have lowered your eyes and stayed quiet, like so many others that night? Think about it, because silence isn't neutral, it always sides with the oppressor. "Please, my son can't breathe." Tanya's voice cut through the hum of the waiting room. It wasn't the voice of a CEO, the calm, composed tone of a woman used to commanding boardrooms and silencing doubt with her authority. No, this was the trembling cry of a mother, stripped of every layer of power and pride, begging strangers to see her child's humanity. Her words were raw, cracked with fear, soaked with urgency. She wasn't asking for favors. She was pleading for her son's life. Jordan clung to her arm, his little body trembling as though his bones could no longer support him. He gasped for air, his lips forming shapes without words, his chest rising and falling in erratic bursts. Tanya could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could hear the desperate rasp of every shallow breath. His eyes, wide, terrified, glassy with tears, locked onto hers, silently begging her to do what no one else in the room seemed willing, to save him. She turned back to the nurse at the desk, her hand pounding against the counter. "Do you hear me? He needs help now. Not later, not when it's convenient. Now." The nurse's eyes narrowed, her jaw tight. "Ma'am, you need to lower your voice. We're doing the best we can. Best you can." Tanya's laugh was bitter, jagged. "You've sent people back before us who walked in minutes ago. My son can't breathe and you're telling me to wait." The nurse looked over Tanya's shoulder, scanning the room as though hoping someone else would intervene and shut her up. A doctor walked past the desk, glancing briefly at the commotion, but didn't stop, didn't ask questions, didn't even slow down. He vanished through the double doors as if Tanya and her son didn't exist at all. Jordan whimpered, a sound so small, so fragile, that it ripped Tanya's heart wide open. She dropped to her knees beside him, cradling his face in her hands. "Baby, hold on, Mummy's here, just breathe. Focus on me, just breathe." Her voice cracked under the weight of her own desperation. "Please," she said again, this time softer, almost broken. She wasn't shouting, now she was begging. Her eyes glistened with tears as she looked up at the nurse, at the line of indifferent faces behind the desk. "He's just a child. Please, I am begging you." The nurse shook, her head, arms folding across her chest like a gate locking tighter. "We can't do anything until you fill out the intake forms. That's the policy." Policy. That word landed like a slap. Policy was the shield being held up to excuse inhumanity. Policy was the excuse that let a child's pain be ignored. Policy was the weapon being used against her, a barrier dressed up as professionalism, masking something far uglier underneath. Tanya's chest heaved, not from exhaustion, but from fury. Her mind screamed at her to shatter that glass, to tear down every paper and every wall standing between her son and the help he needed. But her son's weakening body tethered her to the moment. She couldn't collapse. She couldn't fight. Recklessly, she had to hold on, for him. Look at him. Tanya shouted again, her voice raw, the sound echoing across the sterile room. "Look at his face. He can't wait for your forms, your policy, your procedure. He needs a doctor now." For a brief second, silence fell heavier than ever. And then, from the back of the waiting room, a voice small but steady spoke up. "She's right." Heads turned. It was a man in his 20s, sitting with his hoodie pulled up over his head, his hands clenched in fists at his knees. "You can see the kid can't breathe. Why aren't you doing anything?" His voice cracked, raw with frustration. Tanya looked at him, hope flickering in her chest for the first time that night. Someone else saw. Someone else dared to speak. But before the moment could grow, the nurse's voice sliced it down. "Sir, sit down. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern you." Tanya's hands clenched into fists as she held onto her son. Every word, every dismissal, every second wasted felt like a dagger twisting deeper into her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand the entire room stand with her. But she was met with silence broken only by Jordan's shallow, ragged breaths. This wasn't just negligence. This wasn't just procedure. This was cruelty dressed in scrubs and paperwork. This was the cold decision to value rules over life, to value prejudice over compassion, and Tanya, kneeling on that hospital floor with her son in her arms, knew this wasn't just a battle for breath, was a battle against every barrier that had ever told her and her son that they were less than. She tightened her grip on Jordan's hand, holding him steady, steady enough for both of them. Through her tears, her rage, her despair, she whispered into his ear, "Mummy won't stop. Not until they help you. Not until this ends." And deep down, through the burning humiliation and the pain of being ignored, something began to take root in her, a fire that would not be put out. What about you? If you had been in that room, watching a child fight for every breath, hearing a mother's pleas crash against a wall of silence and policy, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have lowered your head, letting injustice carry on unchecked? Minutes dragged like hours. The waiting room clock ticked mercilessly, each second mocking Tanya as her son's breaths grew shallower, weaker, more desperate. She could feel the uneven rhythm of his chest against her arm, could hear the whistle of air that barely passed through his lungs, and yet no one moved. The staff at the desk continued their routine as though nothing extraordinary was happening. They called names, filled forms, and handed out clipboards as if Tanya and her gasping boy were invisible. Every time another patient's name was called and someone else was led past the swinging double doors, Tanya's heart cracked a little. More, it wasn't just the pain of watching her son suffer, which the humiliation that came with the realization that everyone could see what was happening, but no one cared enough to stop it. It was the way her child was treated, as though his life carried less urgency, less value than the others who walked in after him. She felt the heat of the stairs. It was impossible to escape. People sitting in their chairs with tired faces and folded arms glanced at her, then away, as though her suffering was an uncomfortable movie they couldn't stop watching. Some looked at her with pity, their brows furrowed, their eyes wet, but their bodies remained rooted in place. They would not intervene. They would not rise. They were spectators to her humiliation, unwilling to cross that fragile line into action. One man across from her, his arm in a sling, raised an eyebrow as if silently questioning why she was making such a scene. Another, a mother holding a sleeping toddler, gave Tanya a sympathetic look but quickly shifted her child in her arms, focusing all her attention inward, as if convincing herself that silence was safer. Tanya wanted to scream at them all. Don't you see? Don't you care? This is my child. He is dying in front of you. Her throat burned with words she couldn't release. If she shouted again, security might drag her out. If she stayed quiet, her son might collapse right here on the linoleum floor. Every option felt like a trap designed to crush her. Jordan whimpered softly, his head pressing against her shoulder. "Mummy," he rasped, barely audible, "I'm tired." His eyelids fluttered, heavy and weak. Tanya's heart twisted violently. She couldn't let him close his eyes. Not here, not now. She shook him gently, her tears dripping onto his face. "Stay with me, baby. Stay awake for Mummy, please. Just a little longer, please." She looked around again, her gaze landing on the faces that had become her jury, silent, unhelpful, complicit. She saw whispers to women near the entrance, leaning toward each other, their lips moving fast. She couldn't hear their words, but she could read the looks on their faces: judgment, curiosity, disbelief. Were they whispering about her son? Were they painting her as the hysterical mother, the angry black woman, making noise where silence was expected? The thought fueled the fire already burning in her chest. The staff didn't even try to hide it anymore. A nurse walked right past them, her eyes grazing over Jordan like he was nothing more than a shadow on the floor. She didn't stop. She didn't bend down. She didn't even ask if he was still breathing. Tanya wanted to grab her by the sleeve, force her to look at him, force her to feel the terror that consumed every second of Tanya's existence right now. But she didn't, not yet. The humiliation was suffocating. Not only was her son being denied care, but he was being denied dignity. She was being denied dignity. To plead so openly, to beg on her knees, to hear the staff dismiss her while strangers looked on it was like standing naked in front of a crowd, every ounce of pride stripped away, leaving only raw pain and rage. Jordan coughed, the sound wet and sharp, making a few people flinch in their seats. For the first time, Tanya saw fear flicker across some faces. Fear, not compassion, not urgency, Just fear of contagion, fear of inconvenience, fear of being too close to someone in distress. And still, no one moved. The contrast was unbearable. On one side of the glass partition, Tanya and her son fought for every second. On the other side, staff tapped at keyboards, flipped through charts, and carried on as though they were part of an entirely different universe. The division wasn't just glass, was indifference, prejudice, and a system that had decided who was worthy of care and who could be left to suffer. Tanya pressed her forehead against Jordan's, whispering fiercely into his ear, "I will not let them forget this. I will not let them do this to you. Hold on, baby, just hold on." And in that moment, as her humiliation boiled into rage, Tanya made herself a silent promise. Every pair of eyes that had watched without helping, every uniform that had walked past her son without compassion, every cold, dismissive word spoken to her that night, they would all answer for it. Not tonight, not in this room, but soon. Very soon, because humiliation can break a person, or it can forge them into something unstoppable. Tanya knew which one she was becoming. Would you have sat there silently, watching a mother beg while her child gasped for air? Or would you have stood up, even if it meant facing consequences? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes silence is just another form of violence. The sound came suddenly, cutting through the heavy silence of the waiting room like a blade. "This is wrong." The words exploded from the back row, rough and urgent, filled with the kind of anger that had been boiling beneath the surface for far too long. Heads turned sharply. People who had been avoiding eye contact, people who had been pretending not to notice Tanya's desperation, all snapped their gaze toward the young man in the hoodie. His voice had pierced the fragile bubble of silence that had protected everyone from responsibility. He stood up, his fists clenched, his face flushed with fury. "You can't just let him sit there. The kid can't breathe." His voice shook not with uncertainty, but with the force of his own emotion. He was trembling, his words raw, stripped of politeness, stripped of the restraint that kept others quiet. He had reached his breaking point, and his outrage spilled out for everyone to hear. For the first time that night, Tanya felt something stir inside her chest. Hope. Not much, but enough to make her eyes sting with fresh tears. Someone saw her son. Someone cared enough to speak, to risk the discomfort of breaking the silence. She looked at the young man, gratitude written all over her face. She wanted to thank him, to tell him his courage mattered more than he could ever know. But before the room could shift, before that spark of resistance could catch fire, the nurse at the desk shot him a glare so sharp it could cut steel. Her voice was cold, steady, dripping with authority meant to silence. "Sir, sit down. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern you." The words dropped like a weight on the room. Tanya's stomach twisted at the casual cruelty of it. A child gasping for air, a mother begging for help, and somehow it didn't concern anyone else. The logic was poison. The arrogance was unbearable. The young man shook his head, his voice louder this time, nearly breaking. "What do you mean it doesn't concern me? It concerns all of us." "You can't just security," the nurse barked, snapping her fingers toward the corner where two guards stood near the entrance. And just like that, the fragile spark was crushed. The two men in uniform moved quickly, their heavy boots echoing on the linoleum floor. They approached the young man with grim faces, their hands already raised as if preparing for resistance. The boy in the hoodie backed away instinctively, his hands lifted, his voice still raised. "I'm just saying the truth. This is wrong." "Sir, calm down, or you'll be escorted out," one of the guards warned, his tone sharp, rehearsed, authoritative. The young man looked around the room desperately, his eyes searching for support. He wanted someone else to stand with him, to echo his words, to prove that he wasn't alone. But no one moved, no one spoke. Dozens of eyes looked away again, retreating into silence, pretending they hadn't heard. The humiliation hit Tanya harder than before. Even when someone dared to speak for her son, dared to challenge the injustice happening right in front of them, the system crushed him too. The message was clear: sit down, shut up, or get out. Compassion was treated like defiance. Courage was treated like disruption. The young man's voice cracked one last time. He's just a kid. He needs a doctor. But the guards flanked him, their presence enough to silence him. His shoulders slumped as they forced him back into his seat, one hand pressing firmly against his shoulder. The energy drained out of him, leaving only frustration and shame in its place. Tanya's eyes locked with his for a brief second. He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw apology and unspoken "I tried." She wanted to tell him it was enough, that his voice mattered even if it hadn't changed the outcome. But her throat closed, her words stuck. All she could do was nod, her tears slipping silently down her face. Jordan whimpered again, his little body trembling. Tanya held him tighter, rocking him gently as though her arms alone could keep him alive. Inside, her fury roared louder than ever. Not only had they refused her son help, but they had silenced the one person brave enough to challenge it. It was the breaking point. The moment when Tanya realized this wasn't just about negligence, it was about control. They wanted her quiet. They wanted everyone quiet. They wanted order, even if that order meant her son would collapse in her arms. And in that moment, Tanya made herself another vow. If my son survives this night, I will never forgive them. I will never let this go. They will learn what it means to silence a mother's voice. They will learn what it costs to ignore a child's life. The waiting room settled back into uneasy silence, but something had changed. Tanya no longer begged for mercy. She no longer expected compassion. What burned in her now was something far more dangerous to those who had wronged her resolve. And while her son still fought for breath, Tanya began to plan. If you had been that young man, would you have stood up too, or would you have stayed silent, afraid of being removed? Tell me in the comments, because courage is contagious, but so is fear. And sometimes the choice of one person can decide the fate of another. Through her tears, Tanya leaned down close to her son, brushing damp strands of hair from his forehead. His breathing was shallow, quick little gasps that sounded more like the desperate wheeze of someone drowning than the steady rhythm of a boy's lungs. His skin was clammy under her fingertips, pale where it should have been warm. She whispered so softly it was almost only for him. "Hold on, baby, mummy's here. Don't you dare leave me, not like this. Just hold on." Inside her chest, however, there was a storm raging, and explosion of fury and helplessness tearing through her ribs, threatening to swallow her whole. She wanted to scream at every nurse, at every doctor who walked past without looking, at every person who sat in silence while her son fought for air. She wanted to demand they see him, demand they act, demand they remember the oath they had taken. But instead, she forced herself to stay still, to keep her arms strong and her voice steady for her son. Because she wasn't just any mother. She wasn't just another patient waiting to be seen. Tanya Williams was a woman whose name carried weight in the city. weight that could topple careers and change entire institutions. A CEO whose companies provided thousands of jobs, whose name opened doors in boardrooms most people only dreamed of. She was power, wealth, and influence personified. And yet here, in this fluorescent-lit waiting room, kneeling on a sticky linoleum floor with her son gasping in her arms, she was stripped of it all. None of it mattered. Not her titles, not her empire, not the millions of dollars that passed through her hands every year. To these people, she was just a black mother with a sick child, and that, in their eyes, made her invisible. Tanya bit down on her lips so hard she tasted blood. She wouldn't forget this. Every dismissive glance, every cruel word, every second wasted, they were etching themselves into her memory. And though she could do nothing right now, though her power was useless against the indifference of the staff before her, she knew that this moment would not go unanswered. She was already plotting, already calculating. Even as tears streaked down her cheeks, her mind, trained by years of high-stakes negotiations, began cataloguing every detail. The nurse's name tag, the doctor who turned his head away, the guard who pressed his hand onto the shoulder of the young man who had dared to speak up, the receptionist who shuffled papers with deliberate slowness while Jordan gasped for air. Every face was burned into her memory. Every gesture of cruelty or indifference was recorded like evidence in a case she knew she would prosecute later. Not in a courtroom, but in the court of her own power. "Mum," Jordan whispered faintly, his voice so thin it was nearly lost in the hum of the room. His eyes flickered open just enough to find hers. "It hurts." Tanya nearly broke. Her throat tightened so hard she thought she wouldn't be able to speak at all. But she forced the words out, her voice low but fierce. "I know, baby, I know. It hurts, but you're strong. You're stronger than all of this. Just breathe for me, please. Just keep breathing." She pressed his hand against her chest, right over her heart. "Do you feel that? That's Mummy's heart. As long as it's beating, you're not alone. You hear me? You're not alone." Jordan nodded weakly, his eyes slipping shut again, his small fingers curling into the fabric of her blouse. Tanya turned her head slightly, catching the stares again. A woman across the room quickly looked away when their eyes met. A man in the corner shifted in his seat, pretending to check his phone. No one was willing to look at her for more than a second, as if acknowledging her suffering made them guilty too. She wanted to call them out, to shout, "Why are you all just sitting there?" But she didn't. She saved her strength for her son, and she saved her rage for later, for the moment when it would matter most, when she could unleash it not in desperate pleas, but in decisive action. Tanya knew she was standing at a crossroads. She could let this night crush her, break her down until she was nothing but another nameless victim of an indifferent system. Or she could let it forge her into something sharper, harder, unstoppable. She made her choice. "Hold on, Jordan," she whispered again, stroking his damp hair. "We're going to get through this. And when we do, Mummy is going to make sure nobody ever treats another child this way again. I promise you that." Her voice was calm now, no longer trembling. She didn't raise it. She didn't plead. She spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who knew their power, who knew their reach, who knew that the cruelty surrounding her now was building the foundation for a reckoning none of them could see coming. Tanya closed her eyes for a moment. Steadying herself, she imagined the boardroom table where her voice never went ignored. She imagined the dozens of executives who trembled when she raised an eyebrow. She imagined the press cameras that hung on her every word during public appearances. They had tried to strip her of her power in this room, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. She kissed the crown of her son's head and let her voice soften. You're going to be okay, and Mummy's going to make them pay for every second you suffered here. That's my promise. And though her son could barely keep his eyes open, Tanya knew he heard her. She felt his tiny hand squeeze hers, just enough to let her know he believed her. Would you have had the strength to stay calm, to hold back your rage, while your child fought for breath in front of people who refused to care? Or would you have exploded, screamed, demanded, even if it meant being thrown out? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes strength is silent, and sometimes silence is the loudest threat of all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of humiliation and waiting, Tanya made the hardest decision of her life. She looked down at Jordan, his head heavy against her arm, his chest rising with sharp, uneven breaths, and she realized she couldn't waste another second inside this place. They weren't going to help him. They had made that abundantly clear. Every glance, every refusal, every whispered "wait your turn" had told her the same thing: her son's life was not a priority here. She shifted his weight carefully, lifting him into her arms. He was taller now, heavier than when she used to carry him to bed as a toddler, but in that moment, Tanya drew strength from somewhere deeper than muscle. She stood, holding him close against her body, ignoring the stares that followed her as she turned away from the desk. The nurse looked up briefly, her lips pressed in a tight line, but she didn't say a word. No apology, no offer of help, nothing. Tanya walked out of that waiting room with her head high, even as tears streamed down her face. Each step felt like fire burning under her feet, like defiance carved into the floor. The silence of the people behind her echoed louder than any words they could have spoken. Not one person followed. Not one person stood up to stop her, to help her carrier son to walk out in solidarity. The automatic doors slid open, and the cool night air hit her face like a slap, reminding her of just how alone she was in this battle. She strapped Jordan into the back seat as carefully as she could, his head lolling against the seatbelt. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, buckling him in. "I know it hurts, but we're going to get help. Mummy's taking you somewhere they'll actually see you." His eyes fluttered open for a second, and he gave the faintest nod before slipping back into a half-conscious haze. The drive across town was a blur of headlights, stoplights, and frantic prayers whispered under Tanya's breath. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she sped down the nearly empty streets. Every red light felt like an enemy. Every slow car in front of her like an obstacle designed to steal another second from her son's life. She tapped the steering wheel nervously, whispering, come on, please." She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching Jordan's chest rise and fall in shallow movements. Every time his breaths paused just a little too long, her heart stopped, terror clawing at her throat until the next fragile inhale broke the silence. "Don't you dare leave me. Not like this," she whispered. "You're stronger than this. Just hold on." Finally, the glow of another hospital came into view, a large facility across town, lit up like a beacon against the dark sky. Tanya swerved into the emergency bay, slammed the car into park, and yanked open the back door. She lifted Jordan into her arms again, ignoring the ache in her muscles, ignoring the way her own body screamed for rest. None of that mattered. The sliding doors whooshed open, and the second she stepped inside, the difference was night and day. A nurse behind the counter shot to her feet immediately, her eyes wide at the sight of Jordan gasping in Tanya's arms. "What happened?" the nurse called, rushing forward. "He can't breathe. He's been getting worse for the last hour," Tanya said, her voice trembling but firm. Within seconds, 2 more staff members appeared, one pulling a stretcher, the other grabbing a portable oxygen mask. "Lay him here," one of them ordered. Tanya lowered Jordan onto the stretcher, and immediately they began working. The mask was fitted over his face, a monitor was clipped to his finger, and one nurse knelt beside him, speaking to him gently, encouraging him to stay awake. Tanya stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. The swiftness, the urgency, the humanity of their response, it was everything she had begged for in the last place. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched her hands together, whispering a silent thank you to whoever had given her the strength to keep going. Jordan's chest began to steady slightly under the mask. His breaths weren't normal yet, but they were stronger, deeper, no longer the fragile, wheezing gasps that had terrified her moments ago. Tanya reached for his hand and held it tightly, her tears dripping onto his knuckles. "You're safe. Now, baby, you're safe." One of the doctors glanced up at her, his voice calm but serious. "You got him here just in time. Another hour and it might have been too late." The words hit her like a blow. Just in time. Another hour and she would have lost him. She thought of the first hospital, of the nurse's cold eyes, of the doctor who had walked past without stopping, of the guards silencing the one young man who had spoken up. She thought of every second wasted, every moment they had forced her to sit and watch her son's body fight for survival while they stood idly by. A mix of rage and relief coursed through her veins. Her son was alive, but he had come so close to not being, and Tanya knew with the certainty of someone who had been stripped of everything but resolved that what had happened tonight could never happen again. Not to her child, not to anyone else's. She stroked Jordan's hand gently as the staff wheeled him toward a treatment room. Her tears fell freely now, but behind them was something harder, something fiercer. She had seen the worst of humanity in one building and the best in another, all within the span of an hour, and she knew she could not remain silent about it. Jordan would survive this night. But Tanya had no intention of letting the cruelty that nearly stole him go unpunished. What would you have done if you realized the hospital you trusted with your child's life was willing to let him die? Would you have walked out too? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes survival means knowing when to stop begging and start taking matters into your own hands. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Jordan's hospital room, painting pale gold streaks across his blanket. The soft hum of machines filled the air, each steady beep reminding Tanya that her son was still alive, still fighting, still here with her. She sat in the chair by his bedside, her hands wrapped around his small fingers, unwilling to let go. His breathing was calmer now, supported by oxygen, his body less tense. Every rise and fall of his chest was a victory, but even as relief coursed through her, anger simmered hotter than ever beneath her skin. She thought back to the cold stares of the staff at the first hospital, their refusal to move, the deliberate cruelty in every dismissive word. She thought of the young man who had tried to speak up, only to be silenced by guards. She thought of how close Jordan had come to being just another name, another tragedy explained away by bureaucracy and excuses. She had begged, she had pleaded, she had almost lost her son, and now Tanya sat there not as a desperate mother, but as something more, something the people in that first hospital had no idea. they were creating when they chose to turn their backs on her child. They had awakened the CEO, the woman who commanded respect in every boardroom she entered, the woman who made decisions that shaped futures, the woman who held entire companies in her grasp. When Tanya finally stood from that chair, her face was calm, almost eerily so. She kissed Jordan's forehead softly, whispering, "Rest, baby. Mummy's got work to do." Then she stepped into the hallway, pulled out her phone, and began making calls. The first call was to her assistant, who answered immediately despite the early hour. "Ma'am, I need every detail on the administrative and medical staff. Working last night at St. Matthew's. Names, positions, shifts. Pull every piece of information you can get." Her voice was flat, businesslike, stripped of the desperation that had filled it just hours earlier. "Yes, ma'am." Right away. The second call was to a board member she trusted, a man who owed her more than a few favors. "I want to know who oversees that facility. Get me their chain of command and their financial reports. I don't care how you do it." "Yes." "Understood." By the time Tanya slipped into the waiting area with a steaming cup of hospital coffee, her assistant had already sent the first wave of data to her email. Tanya scanned through it, her jaw tightening with every line. Names, faces, roles. These were not just faceless enemies anymore. They were people who had stood in front of her, while her son gasped for air and decided he wasn't worth saving. She leaned back in the chair, her eyes narrowing as she whispered to herself, "You thought I was powerless. You thought I was just another mother you could ignore. You had no idea." Her mind replayed the moment the nurse had dismissed her cries, the exact tone she had used. She could still hear the sharp bark of sit down aimed at the young man who had dared to speak. Every word carved deeper into her resolve. By afternoon, Tanya walked into Jordan's room again, dressed not in the rumpled clothes from last night, but in a tailored suit she had requested someone bring from home. The transformation was striking. No longer the frantic mother begging for scraps of compassion, but the formidable leader the world knew her as. Jordan's eyes fluttered open weakly, and he gave her a small smile. "You look like you're going." "To a meeting," he whispered, his voice hoarse but teasing. Tanya leaned down, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "I am, sweetheart, the most important one of my life." And with that, she left the hospital, sliding into the back seat of a sleek black car waiting outside. As the driver pulled away, Tanya stared out the window, her city rushing by. Every glass building reflected her determination back at her. Every intersection felt like a countdown to the moment she would walk into St. Matthew's, again not as a victim, but as a reckoning. The car slowed in front of the familiar brick facade of the hospital that had nearly cost her everything. The sight of it made her stomach twist, but her expression remained unreadable. She stepped out, her heels striking the pavement with sharp precision, each step louder than the last. People turned as she entered, their eyes catching on the power in her stride, the fire in her gaze. The waiting room looked exactly as it had the night before. The same dull lighting, the same peeling posters on the wall, the same receptionist, sitting at the desk with a face that still carried the smugness of authority. Tanya stood in the center of the room, scanning the faces of those who had watched silently while she suffered. A few looked away quickly, recognizing her, guilt flickering. In their eyes, the nurse at the desk froze, her jaw tightening. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously, though her tone carried the same thin veil of superiority. Tanya smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only ice. "Yes, you can help me. Go ahead and gather every staff member who was here last night. Tell them Tanya Caldwell wants to speak with them now." The name dropped like a thunderclap in the room. A murmur rippled through the air as recognition spread. Tanya Caldwell, CEO, Powerhouse, a woman whose face had been splashed across magazines and business networks. The nurse blinked, her confidence faltering. I don't know if do it," Tanya interrupted sharply, her voice cutting like glass. "Because if you don't, I'll make one phone call and have this entire department shut down by the end of the week." The nurse paled, fumbling for the phone. Within minutes, whispers filled the corridors, and one by one, the staff who had stood by last night began to file into the waiting area. The doctor who had brushed past without stopping, the guards who had silenced the boy in the hoodie, the same nurse who had told her to sit down and wait. They stood in a nervous cluster, trying to hold their composure under Tanya's unyielding stare. She let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on them. Then, slowly, she spoke. "You looked at a child who was struggling to breathe, and you decided he wasn't worth your time. You heard a mother beg for help, and you silenced her. You watched humanity dying in front of you, and you chose procedure over compassion, prejudice over duty." Her voice never wavered. Every word was sharp, deliberate. "Last night, you thought I was powerless, but today, you learn who I am." A ripple of fear crossed their faces, and for the first time, Tanya felt something shift in the room. Power. She held it now, not them. She straightened her shoulders, her voice cold as steel. "You're all finished here, every last one of you. If you had been standing in that waiting room, watching Tanya return in power after being humiliated, would you have cheered for her or stayed silent again? Let me know in the comments, because silence in the face of injustice is just as dangerous as the injustice itself." The silence that followed Tanya's words was thick enough to choke on. The staff stared at her, their faces pale, their eyes darting between one another as if someone, anyone, might step forward to speak. No one did. The waiting room was crowded, every seat filled, and yet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above, the faint buzzing of a vending machine at the back. It was as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting to see what this woman would do next. Tanya's eyes swept over the crowd of hospital staff like a blade. Pausing long enough on each face to make them squirm, she could see the fear in their posture, the stiff shoulders, the clamped jaws, the trembling hands hidden in pockets. These were the people who, just last night, had looked down at her as if she were less than nothing. They had crossed their arms, shrugged off her cries, and turned their backs while her son gasped for air. Now, with the morning light streaming in from the lobby windows, they looked like children caught in a lie. "You think I'm bluffing," Tanya said finally, her voice low, almost calm. That calmness made it worse. "You think this is just a scene, a mother venting her anger. No, this isn't a scene. This is accountability." The head nurse shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, please. We were following protocol. There was nothing personal, nothing personal." Tanya snapped, her voice cutting the air in two. "My son nearly died because of your protocol." He clutched his chest, gasping for air, and you looked him in the eyes and told him to wait. "If he hadn't survived, what would you have told me then?" "Nothing personal." Her words echoed across the waiting room, bouncing off the sterile walls. A murmur rippled through the crowd of patients and visitors who had gathered there. Phones raised, recording every second. Tanya knew these videos would spread. She wanted them to. "You didn't just fail as medical professionals," she continued, her gaze hardening. You failed as human beings. And when you fail at that level, you don't get to keep the privilege of this position. You don't get to wear that coat, or carry that badge, or stand in this building pretending you serve the public. The doctor, who had brushed her aside last night, cleared his throat. His voice was shaky, the arrogance gone. "Ms. Caldwell, please, we can discuss this in private. Private." Tanya turned to the crowd, gesturing with an open hand. "They want to discuss this in private. They humiliated me in public. They ignored my son in public. They let a child suffer in front of all of you, and now they want to hide the truth. Behind closed doors." Her eyes flicked back to the doctor, her tone sharp as glass. "No, you don't get to choose the arena anymore. You chose last night. Now it's my turn." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others calling, "Out, tell them." Phones tilted higher, flashes lit the room. The doctor shrank under the weight of it. Tanya turned slowly, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor, her presence filling the space like a storm building. "Every single one of you who stood by, who let this happen, is finished here, effective. Immediately, you are dismissed. I've already spoken with the board. Your contracts are terminated. Security will escort you out, and replacements are already on their way." Gasps filled the room, sharp intakes of breath like a chorus of disbelief. The staff erupted in protest, voices overlapping, panic slipping into their tones. "You can't do this. This isn't fair. I've worked here for 20 years. Tanya raised her hand, and the room quieted almost instantly, her authority undeniable. "Fair." Her voice dripped with scorn. "Fair is my son being treated like any other child who walked through those doors. Fair is a mother not being forced to beg for compassion. You denied us fairness when you chose prejudice over humanity. Don't talk to me about fair." The same security guards who had silenced the young man the night before now stood uncertain at the edge of the group. Tanya's eyes locked onto them. "You silenced someone who spoke up for justice. You silenced the only person in that room who had the courage to say the truth. You're as guilty as the rest. Hand in your badges. Today, you answer for your choices." The guards hesitated, their faces flushed with shame. Slowly, one after the other, they removed their badges and placed them on the desk. The sight drew a hushed gasp from the crowd. Some of the staff tried pleading, their voices desperate now. "We didn't mean it wasn't like that. Please, I have a family." Tanya's gaze softened for just a moment, but it wasn't mercy they sit, was resolve. "I have a family too," she said quietly. "And last night, you didn't care if I lost mine. Don't ask me for sympathy you never gave." The air in the waiting room grew heavy. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Tanya turned her back on them and addressed the watching crowd. Her voice carried with the weight of both authority and pain. "Let this be a lesson. Let this be a warning. Silence is complicity, neglect is violence, and prejudice kills. If you ever find yourself in a room like this, watching someone suffer while others look away, speak up, because your silence could be the difference between life and death." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger, building until the entire lobby thundered with it. The young man from the night before, who had been dragged out by those same guards, appeared at the entrance. His eyes met Tanya's, and he raised his fist in quiet solidarity. Tanya gave him the smallest nod, her lips curling into the faintest. Smile, the staff, stood in stunned silence, their careers unraveling before them. Tanya's words had landed, her power undeniable. For the first time since that terrible night began, she felt a measure of justice. Not enough to erase the pain, not enough to undo the fear she had felt watching her son struggle, but enough to remind the world that her voice, her son's life, her dignity mattered. Would you have cheered for her in that moment, standing in that waiting room as justice was served? Or would you have looked away, silent and complicit? Tell me in the comments, because what happened here isn't just a story, it's a warning to all of us. Do you want me to expand chapter 10 next, making it a powerful conclusion that ties together the emotional climax with a strong message on dignity, equality, and courage? The applause eventually faded into a hush, but the energy in the room remained alive, crackling like a fire that had only just been lit. Tanya stood there, breathing deeply, taking in the moment, not as a mother begging for help, but as a woman who had taken back every ounce of power that had been denied to her the night before. She could still see her son's pale face in her mind, the way his small chest struggled for air while those around him had done nothing. That memory would haunt her for the rest of her life, but it was also the reason she stood so tall now, refusing to bow her head, refusing to let the world brush this moment away. Her son was safe, recovering in a quiet room across town, and though her heart longed to be with him, she knew she had to finish this here. What she had started wasn't just about her boy anymore. It was about every mother who had ever been dismissed, every father whose words had been ignored, every child who had been looked at as less deserving of urgency, of dignity, of simple care, just because of the color of their skin. She looked around at the faces staring back at her, some guilty, some ashamed, some deeply moved, their eyes glistening with tears. "What happened here last night will not be forgotten," she said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of truth. "This is not just about my child. This is about every person who's been made to wait while others are rushed ahead. This is about every life dismissed as if it doesn't matter. This is about every door slammed in the face of justice." Her words struck the air like thunder, and the silence of the crowd was not indifference, was reverence, or even fear. People shifted in their seats, clutching their phones, some whispering to one another, but no one dared interrupt her. "You watched last night," she continued, turning toward the bystanders. "Some of you spoke, some of you looked away, some of you recorded, but none of you forced them to act. I don't say this to shame you. I say this to remind you your voice matters, your courage matters. Silence is a choice, and it can be as deadly as a weapon." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. If one person speaks, they can be silenced. But if 10, 20, 100 voices rise up together, justice cannot be ignored. Remember that. Don't ever forget it. A ripple of murmurs flowed through the room, people nodding, some with tears sliding down their cheeks. Tanya's voice softened, carrying more warmth now than anger. "My son survived because I refused to give up, because I refused to accept their lies, their rules, their excuses. But not everyone gets that chance. Too many families have buried their loved ones because someone thought their life didn't matter. Too many children have suffered while others were given priority. That ends here, at least in this place, and I pray it sparks a fire everywhere else." She let her gaze sweep across the room one last time, fixing her eyes on the staff who had been dismissed. They looked small now, stripped of the authority they once wore like armor. "You had a choice," she told them. "You chose wrong. Today, you face the consequences. May you never forget the lesson of what your silence, your neglect, your prejudice nearly cost. Tanya turned toward the crowd again, and this time she let the emotion in her voice tremble through. I am not just a CEO. I am not just a mother. I am a woman who believes every life matters, every child matters, and I will use every bit of power I have to make sure what happened to my son never happens to anyone else's child. A standing ovation broke out, this time stronger, louder, undeniable. People clapped until their hands hurt, some shouting yes, and that's right. The energy was no longer one of shame, but of unity, of collective strength. For the first time, the hospital felt less like a place of suffering and more like the site of a reckoning. Tanya stood still, receiving their energy, knowing this was bigger than her, bigger than one night, bigger than one hospital. She knew this story would travel, that her son's pain would not be in vain, that others would hear and recognize their own experiences in hers. That knowledge fueled her as much as the applause. As the noise softened again, she leaned forward, slightly, speaking not just to the people in front of her, but to every unseen soul beyond those walls. The lesson is simple, she said, her voice calm, resolute, unwavering. When you see injustice, don't look away. When someone is suffering, don't stay silent. When prejudice rears its head, don't let it stand unchallenged. Courage is contagious. Compassion is powerful. And together, we can make sure dignity is not something earned, but something given freely to every human being. She allowed the last words to linger, sinking deep into the hearts of everyone listening. Then she took a step back, her work here complete. Security began escorting the dismissed staff out, some leaving in tears, others in silence, but all with the weight of her words pressing heavily on their shoulders. Tanya finally turned, her heels clicking against the floor, and walked toward the exit. As she reached the door, the young man from the night before, the one who had dared to speak when no one else would, was waiting. He didn't say a word, just gave her a nod of respect, his eyes shining with pride. Tanya returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement between two warriors who had fought in different ways the same battle. When she stepped outside, the morning air was cool, crisp, alive with possibility. The world felt different, not because it had changed overnight, but because she had forced it to confront itself, to look in the mirror and see its own cruelty. And that, she knew, was the first step towards something better. As she slid into the car waiting for her, Tanya whispered to herself, never again. It wasn't just a promise to her son. It was a vow to every child, every parent, every human being, and now, to everyone watching this. I ask you, what would you have done if you were there that night? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent, afraid to make waves? Drop your answer in the comments, because your voice matters here just as much as it would have mattered then. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the more voices we raise together, the harder it is for anyone to silence us. Stories like this aren't just stories. They are calls to action. They remind us that silence is dangerous, but courage can change everything.